can see that. So thanks very much for coming to my talk, everybody. I have to say, I think this is probably the first time I've done a talk for Barleyp in my slippers, so that's making me feel a little bit more comfortable. So I'm going to be talking about a dynamic unfolding of the lesson, and in particular, teachable moments. So we want to explore what are called teachable moments in online EAP classes, and we're going to use the Autonomy toolkit from Legitimation Code Theory, which I'll talk about. I need to define teachable moments, and I'm going to illustrate with a planned teachable moment from the lesson materials. I should say that in the chat, I put a link to the lesson materials if anybody wanted to open up the actual materials. I'm not going to talk about them a great deal. We're going to analyse the planned teachable moment using the Autonomy toolkit to demonstrate the analysis, and then think about some spontaneous teachable moments and think about what the characteristics of successful teachable moments are. So on the basis of the analysis of our data we've been doing at the moment, we think that teachable moments need to link closely to core lesson aims to enable integration of knowledge and transfer to new contexts. So teachable moments, defined by Haug and Myhill and Warren as teachable or critical moments, they're instances in the lesson, and they can be planned or spontaneous when the flow is interrupted to address specific student needs. And the key thing about them is they introduce uncertainty. You don't know where the lesson's going to go if you follow one of these moments, and you've got to be prepared to assess in the moment whether it's worth following or worth saying to a student who's asked a question, well, let's deal with that later. So the online recorded lessons that we had in 2020 provided opportunities to observe teachable moments in recorded lessons without the so-called observer paradox, because it's actually a very brave and confident teacher who, in an observed lesson that they prepared with the observer, will depart from the lesson plan to follow a teachable moment. So we were interested in knowing what makes a teachable moment successful and how they contribute to student learning. So the context of the study was the lesson that I put in the chat, and you can see the link there. It comes from Access EAP Frameworks, Unit 8, and it's Section 4. So Unit 8 concentrates on academic argument and critical reading, and in particular, ideas such as a nuanced stance, writer's voice, and real skeptical, oh, now I forget that term, never mind. But the section that we're looking on this lesson looks at activating writer's voice, and it has two kind of aspects to it. There's a procedural aspect, which looks at a framework for the activation of writer's voice, and then an analytical aspect, which looks at two student texts, one with a stronger writer's voice than the other. So for this talk and for the study, we're taking examples from a bank of 32 recordings that teachers from the summer last year and their students gave permission for us to use, and we have ethical approval from Heriot-Watt University for this study. So I'm going to talk first about planned teachable moments, just so that I can illustrate what I mean by a teachable moment. So this lesson centres on an essay task, and it uses extracts from sources, for example, the WHO definition of health, and the students are asked to follow an essay task, critically evaluate definitions of health as a concept for health professionals. And I'd observed this lesson in the past and realised that the first part of it needed to be scaffolded a little bit, because teachers didn't always approach it in appropriate ways. You'd get a brainstorm of health, for example, which didn't really go anywhere and didn't help the lesson to get going. So the scaffolding was this: to put up the WHO definition and to ask the students to critically evaluate it based on their own experience of healthcare. Is this definition possible? Is it appropriate for healthcare professionals? So I'm going to analyse that teachable moment using the Autonomy toolkit of Legitimation Code Theory. And we've seen a number of lovely talks, I think, in this conference on this new theory. I've found it really generative in terms of thinking about practice. And one of the papers that for me, really helped me to understand it at the beginning is this paper by Ingold and O'Sullivan. And so this quote comes from them. And it's what students have to be able to do at university. They have to be able to take meaning-packed, non-context dependent language of the kind that they read in academic papers, and they have to prove they understand it by unpacking it and grounding it in the real world. And it's that grounding in the real world, i.e. in their own world. So they have to be able to integrate new concepts that they're learning into their existing knowledge and experience. So the autonomy codes, autonomy is a bit of a misleading label because we're used to the idea of teacher and student autonomy, but it doesn't relate to that. It's about the bounded nature of knowledge. So we can talk about disciplines, for example, having different kinds of knowledge. Law and medicine and engineering are all looking at different kinds of knowledge. So autonomy is about the boundaries around knowledge. So we've seen people are doing lots of good work around the semantic codes, and they look at how knowledge accumulates over time and waves between general abstract concepts and specific real world contexts. And we know that the waving is the important thing to do. So what the autonomy codes do is to explore the boundaries between different types of knowledge and how these can be integrated over time. So this is the integration of knowledge as opposed to the accumulation. My colleague and friend Sue suggested that semantic codes were like geology and autonomy codes were like geography, but that could be a metaphor a bit too far, but it's a way of thinking about it. And so the two different codes form a matrix, and so they are the positional autonomy, how are other types of knowledge positioned in relation to the core, and then relational autonomy, what's the relation between these different types of knowledge. So these are high-level codes. They're very abstract concepts and can be applied in lots and lots of different contexts, and they explore practices in any of the contexts they're applied in, which are possible and valued. And I guess that's the legitimation aspect of it. So what you have to do is produce a translation device that grounds it in your context. And so that's what I'm doing here. So if you PA plus, RA plus, the top right-hand quadrant is what's called sovereign. So this is the lesson we're dealing with, the core components for developing writer's voice. And in the case of the teachable moment we're looking at, it's the critical questioning around the WHO definition. And so then in the bottom left-hand corner, you have what's called the exotic quadrant. So that's the knowledge and experience familiar to students, which the teacher won't necessarily know, and which we want the students to connect to. And then on the right, they're similar purpose but different content. We've got Introjected, where the exotic is linked to the purpose using explanations which link back to the core lesson aims. And then in the top left-hand corner, Projected, where we're using the lesson content for different purposes. And in our case, it happens to be for assessment. So we're interested in autonomy trips because learning needs to move between these different codes in this lesson to maximize understanding. So you can't stay in the sovereign code and just get a whole bunch of concepts fired at you. Students have to be able to link to their existing knowledge, so we have to move to the exotic code. But if you're not careful, that can result in a one-way trip. And unless this teacher or the students can make return trips to link back to the main content and purpose of the lesson. And I'll show some examples of these later on. So effective teaching practice supports the students to make a round trip. They want to go from sovereign to exotic and back to sovereign via Introjected for an explanation. And what we can really say is a round trip warrants the link between the sovereign and the exotic and facilitates the transfer to other contexts. So this is the planned teachable moment that we're going to analyse to show you how the toolkit was used. And it requires the students to develop a provisional point of view on the essay task, critically evaluate definitions of health as a concept. And so the scaffolding planned teachable moment was to say, well, look at the WHO definition. how useful or achievable is this for health professionals? So think about your own context and your knowledge of your health system. Is this a useful definition? And then think about some scenarios based on this. Could somebody with a physical disability or a mental health problem be defined as healthy? So that's the task that we're looking at. So what would a pathway for the teachable moment look like? So it would say, well, the critical evaluation of the WHO definition is based on critical questioning. We want the students to apply those critical questions in their own experience and understanding, moving to the exotic. We want them to move back to Introjected to challenge the WHO definition and relate their scenarios and experience to it, and then move back to Sovereign to realise that what they've just done is a critical evaluation of this particular definition. So what I'm going to do now is look at some of the examples that we're taking from the talk of these planned teachable moments, just to show you what some of the teachers did, and then look a little bit quite quickly at the spontaneous teachable moments, what other things they did. So a caveat, of course. Last year was extraordinary, we all know that. And we have to realise that the data we've got, you know, is based on an unfamiliar teaching content in some cases. We had a lot of new teachers. An unfamiliar and unreliable delivery platform. We used Blackboard, it didn't always work. There was lots and lots of chat on the discussion list about that problem. An unfamiliar flipped learning delivery mode, which, although we have a week of induction, we didn't really have enough time to explain exactly what that meant and what you should do. And I was struck by Paula Villegas's talk using Bloom's taxonomy, just to say, this is what flipped learning is. I mean, that's such a nice idea, which I hadn't thought about. And then actually the psychological pressure of the reduced face medium, because teachers and Maha Bali talked about, you know, that well-being online, and there was a lot of problems there. And so what we found was that some teachers defaulted to novice status. They talked all the time and they forgot what their good teaching practices, which would have been intuitive in the classroom. So we're going to see a number of different examples of this. So here's a teacher that took a one-way trip around this planned teachable moment into the exotic code, but she didn't really involve the students. So she asked a question, do you feel healthy? And they all showed that they did by showing a smiley emoji face. And then she proceeded to go on and second guess the fact that perhaps they weren't actually all that healthy after all. Their mental health was suffering, or their social well-being was suffering. And so she talked about a topic, well-being, and not about critical evaluation. So the trip kind of moved to the exotic and then disappeared. It never came back anywhere. This one didn't involve the students in thinking about their own experience, but moved to Introjected to deconstruct the definition. So there's a problem, and students could offer a challenge. It's a little too strict, it's too broad. The teacher responds to that, but then stays in Introjected. So it's important to think about this. Is there just one definition? Are there any problems? They've not been told that they are doing critical evaluation there, so they don't return to the sovereign code to label the process. This one, one or two teachers did this actually. The planned teachable moment was meant to take about 5 minutes. It's just a little warm-up exercise. This teacher took about 12 or 13 minutes. The trip started well with a move to Introjected, and the student gave the teacher everything they needed. So this definition gives no guidance to health professionals on how to measure health. I mean, like right there, we've got it, haven't we? You know, so would you like to say a bit more about that? What do we need to measure? What in your etc. He said, this is a great observation. We'll be talking about that later. And then he set off chasing the topic well beyond exotic in quite a controversial way. I'm interested in healthcare systems around the world. What should they pay for? Should they pay for mental health treatment or cosmetic surgery or HIV or abortions? And the students were desperately trying to follow him. And at the end of it, he said, it's important to have an opinion, which is not quite the same as saying we're critically evaluating here. So But 11 teachers of the 32 that we had were able to move to exotic and then introjected. Only 5 teachers managed the round trip to sovereign code. And you can see an example here. So the teacher saying, well, we're going to try to evaluate this definition. And then between the teacher and students, there was a collaborative conversation where they discussed scenarios which the teacher had provided. So what about somebody who's blind or doesn't like going into society very much, or even struggles to understand their academic subject? Could we describe them as unhealthy? And then she summarizes. Critical thinking means you reflect, you generate some questions. This is what we're doing, critically engaging. So this is the kind of planned teachable moment we're hoping to see. So this lesson was delivered in week 5, and the first assignment deadline was at the end of that week. The lesson's constructively aligned to the assignment with a framework for writer's voice coming at the end of it, which is supposed to support self-reflection and peer review for the assignment. So most of the spontaneous teachable moments took a move to projected to discuss this assignment in terms of citation and referencing. Just remember, you've got to get these things right. In terms of plagiarism and paraphrasing, and this was really quite disappointing because writer's voice is all about not formulaic paraphrasing by changing the order of words and substituting words, and several teachers actually just said that. And student questions, finding arguments, giving opinions, using iron writing. So these were triggers for some of the spontaneous teachable moments. So we identified 31 spontaneous teachable moments across 14 lessons, between about 1 and 6, but only about 6 teachers were able to return explicitly to sovereign to link to writer's voice. And the teachers either didn't recognise that all of these things actually involve writer's voice, or didn't think explicit constructive alignment was necessary. So our conclusion, preliminary, because we're still analysing the data, is planned and spontaneous teachable moments let students connect to their own experience, excuse me, to show the teachers what the students know and what they still need to learn. And the most successful ones arise within a collaborative conversation between teacher and students. So analysing these planned and spontaneous teachable moments using the Autonomy Toolkit uncovers valued teaching practices and enables transfer. It identifies constructive alignment of aims, content, assessment, or the lack of this, and therefore it identifies areas for professional development for teachers. So those are my references, and I'd point you towards the freely available resources at the Legitimation Code Theory website. It's quite a tricky thing to get your head around, but it's a very very nice theory, you know, which I think is very generative in thinking about practice. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and come back to the main room. See if there are any questions. How am I doing for time? So that's not too bad.
Good time. Yeah, I've got 10 minutes for questions. Thank you, Olwyn. That's great.
Brian, I haven't been looking at the chat, so I haven't seen what questions there are, but let me just have a look.
Okay.
So could you post again in the chat link to the lesson materials? What was the 2012 introductory article that was mentioned earlier? Oh God, I don't know, I can't remember. What did I say? I'll have to come back to that one. I wrote it down, Ingold and O'Sullivan. Yeah, I found that one because it was in modern language teaching. It was just really down at our level, you know, didn't assume any detailed knowledge of the for some reason I'm not able to, here we go. Sorry. Good, that's fine. Great. I'm familiar with semantics. Have you thought about overlap? So that's a question I can answer because we have, and we can just go mad with our metaphors and say, well, it's a space-time continuum, because semantics is really about how things evolve over time, and autonomy is about how things move around in space. And the key thing which people looking at semantics emphasize is this need to wave up, to get back to there's an interesting article by Jim Martin, systemic functional linguist, and he talks about power words, power grammar, and power composition. And the power words are words like critical evaluation, nuanced stance, and these are things that we want our students to be able to use. So the waving up or the coming back to the sovereign code is where we demonstrate for them how you use these words and how they relate to the experiences they've just talked about. Any other questions? They're coming in a bit fast now for me to, let's have a look.
Yeah, we have a comment here, 946 from Michael Hughes. I would argue that some situations discourage SGMs because teachers are asked to stick rigidly to materials and plans.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And ours did. What was interesting, I think, is that these lessons had 3 planned teachable moments where teachers were encouraged to move away from just reading. We gave the teachers PowerPoint slides to use in the platform, but they were encouraged to move away and develop collaborative conversations, asking their students what they, you know, for their opinions, basically, just as you would in a classroom. And a lot of teachers, some teachers were able to do this really effectively, and some teachers just didn't feel confident enough. And so that's what I said, you know, it's the unfamiliarity of the platform, and this range of experiences lets us see, you know, what kinds of things you need to do to help teachers to feel more comfortable on that platform. If this is a description of good teaching, why apply fancy labels? Yeah, well, those aren't my labels, Bennett. Those are the labels from the Legitimation Code Theory people. And in fact, the labels get even more exotic than that. There's a very good talk by Carl Maton on the Legitimation Code Theory website on the Autonomy Toolkit. And he's looking at these in lessons for history, Roman history, and geography. And so they actually use labels from those subjects. So we pull back from that, but those aren't my labels. But I would argue that we want our students to be able to handle labels. They're going to be learning about high-level concepts, thermodynamics, third-party logistics, you know, various other things and other subjects. We should be able to help them handle these sorts of labels, unpack them, and then repack them. And these are the power words that Jim Martin is talking about. What are the implications for teacher development or induction practices? So just very quickly around that one, I think doing a talk like this in induction and then letting the teachers listen, because we get a lot of returning teachers, giving them their recording and say, what do you think? And we've always introduced Legitimation Code Theory into the pre-sessional over the last 2 or 3 years, just as a way of trying to say, this is what the materials are trying to do. And so it's an aspect of teacher development, I think, and we would want the teachers to, again, reflect on what they did and what they might do differently. And then Steve there moves around the autonomy plane, help the waving up and down. I absolutely agree. So moving into the exotic would be a wave down into people's personal lives, and then back to sovereign and up to conceptual. So as I say, it's a sort of a space-time continuum, and they you know, they do work together, right? It's just that we happen to be just using the one of them. Do you think materials should more explicitly elicit the teachable moments? Well, I have tried to say to teachers when I was doing the induction, this is a 5-minute exercise. Don't spend 12 minutes on this, but you can't stop a teacher who's used to riffing on a topic, which is what a couple of the teachers did. And it's that attitude that so long as they're talking, it's fine. Doesn't matter what they're doing. We're not here to teach anything. We're just here to chat, practice, and that's not the approach that I think we should be using. Emerging language, as we call it at the British Council. Well, who knows, Luke? I don't know enough about I mean, I think if you're talking about Scott Thornberry and his dogma approach and language that emerges out of the classroom, I actually think even spontaneous teachable moments probably have to be planned for a little bit if you're going to be able to link them back to concepts that everybody's talking about. So could exotic ever be top of the wave? Oh, Maxine, I can't answer that. Steve might be able to. And again, teacher training, professional development. I just think teachers need to know about this theory, and I would get them to start with the Ingold and O'Sullivan article. And then I think with all these water metaphors, I need a lifeboat. It's great, yes. There's a lot of quantum theory language in legitimation code theory. Yes, well, I agree, but I think we need to engage with our students' STEM subjects. They wouldn't have a problem with that. I don't think there are any more questions. So that's probably time for me to stop. Unless anybody has anything particular they want me to cover. I think it is time for me to stop. Yeah.
Okay, Olwyn, thank you very much. So I shall stop the recording now, and then we'll hand it over to Hilary Nessie for the second half. Okay.
Right.